There are over 200 coronaviruses in nature. 7 affect humans. 4 are endemic respiratory viruses that cause up to 1/3 of common colds. Endemic refers to a disease or condition that is regularly found among particular people or in a certain area. 2 of the 7 coronaviruses that affect humans are epidemic, the widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a community at a particular time. The first of these is SARS-CoV-1, the coronavirus that causes secure acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS. It first infected humans in 2002 in southern China. The SARS outbreak resulted in 8,000 cases in 26 countries. 800 people died from the disease. It is believed to be a zoonotic disease, one that can be transmitted from animals to people. It is suspected to have originated in bats. The other epidemic coronavirus is MERS-CoV. This is the coronavirus that causes Middle East respiratory syndrome, or MERS. It was first reported in 2012 in the Arabian Peninsula. There have been nearly 2,500 cases of MERS. 858 people have died from the disease, a mortality rate of over 34%. MERS is also believed to be a zoonotic disease. The virus has been found in camels. The 7th coronavirus that affects humans is SARS-CoV-2, a new type of coronavirus that causes coronavirus disease 2019, abbreviated as COVID-19. It was first identified this past December in Wuhan, a city of over 11 million in Hubei province, China. Analysis of genome sequence data found no evidence that the virus was made in a laboratory or otherwise engineered. This is important because there have been some conspiracy theorists in the United States who claim that the virus was intentionally produced in China. There have also been reports, possibly being disseminated by the Chinese Communist Party, that the virus was produced in a US Army laboratory. In fact, scientists believe the virus causing COVID-19 is also a zoonotic disease. A study published this week suggests it is a recombination of a virus found in bats and another virus possibly originating in pangolins, which are scaly anteaters. The first reports of COVID-19 infections came from China at the end of last year. By early March, there were 118,000 cases reported in 114 countries. Over 4,300 had died from the disease. On March 11th, the World Health Organization declared the COVID-19 outbreak a pandemic. As of April 2nd, there have been nearly 1 million cases and 50,000 deaths worldwide. Over 13,000 have died in Italy, over 10,000 have died in Spain, and the US death toll has topped 5,000 and is climbing. The United States now has the largest number of confirmed COVID cases in the world. As of April 2nd, there are over 217,000 confirmed cases. COVID-19 has been declared a pandemic, but what is that? A pandemic occurs when a disease is prevalent throughout a country or the whole world. When disease breaks out on a global scale, what are the implications for human society? Frank Snowden, a professor of history at Yale, has written that pandemics are not random events that afflict societies capriciously and without warning. They have shaped politics, crushed revolutions, altered economies, and entrenched racial and economic discrimination. They reveal much about society's structure, its standard of living, and its political priorities. Pandemics also reflect our relationship with the environment, the one we have built, and the natural environment that responds. They show the moral relationships that we have toward each other as people. In short, they hold up a mirror to human beings to show us who we really are. It would take much longer than the time I have here to do this topic justice, but let's take a brief look at pandemics throughout history and how they demonstrate Professor Snowden's observations. The Antonine Plague broke out when Rome was at its zenith during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. It was probably spread by Roman soldiers returning from wars fought on the periphery of the empire. Many towns and villages in the Italian peninsula and the European provinces lost all of their inhabitants. Rome's defense of its northern and eastern territories was greatly hampered when the ranks of Roman armies were thinned by the disease. The health, social, and economic crisis produced by the plague marked the beginning of the decline of Rome. A century and a half before this pandemic broke out, the Emperor Diocletian split the Roman Empire in two. When the disease struck, Justinian I was emperor of the empire in the east, or the Byzantine Empire. Historians named the pandemic after him. He also contracted the disease but survived. The outbreak was probably a consequence of early globalization, specifically the explosion of trade in the ancient world. The disease originated in Africa, but then spread to Europe through rats carrying infected fleas on merchant ships. It quickly spread to port cities around the Mediterranean, reaching Constantinople in 541 AD. Justinian had sought to reunite the Roman Empire, but the plague pandemic weakened the Byzantine Empire just as his armies had nearly retaken all of Italy and the western Mediterranean coast. It squelched Justinian's aspirations for reunification. The plague also produced an apocalyptic atmosphere that spurred the rapid spread of Christianity. 3 of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history were caused by a single bacterium, Yersinia pestis. It is transmitted by fleas who pick up the bacterium from infected, dying rats. The fleas then spread the disease when they attempt to feed off another host. Bubonic plague is a horrible and deadly disease. Its symptoms include 1 or more infected, enlarged, and painful lymph nodes, and decay and decomposition of the skin. The Black Death killed anywhere from 75 to 200 million when it peaked in the mid-14th century. It is believed to have originated in Central or East Asia from traders on the Silk Road. Later, it spread by fleas living on black rats who hitched a ride on Genoese merchant ships, which dispersed it throughout the Mediterranean and Europe. It took 200 years for Europe's population to recover. Medieval medicine was very primitive, and people had no scientific understanding of contagion. Sorcery and witchcraft were often cited as a cause of the plague. Some attributed the plague to foul odors emitted by victims. Others believed it was punishment by God for their sins. The French College of Medicine advanced an astronomical explanation, specifically a conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn in the year 1345. But in general, many blamed the usual suspects: Jews, the Roma, and other foreigners, many of whom were attacked and killed. There was suspicion that the disease had something to do with proximity. That's why officials in the Venetian-controlled port city of Ragusa decided to keep newly arrived sailors in isolation until they could prove they weren't sick. This enforced isolation of 40 days was called a Quarantino, which is the origin of the English word quarantine and the start of its practice in the Western world. The Black Death changed the course of Europe's history. It reinvigorated the Inquisition because it was thought that heretics carried the disease. England and France were so incapacitated by the disease, they called a truce to their war. The British feudal system collapsed when the plague changed economic circumstances and demographics. Having ravaged the populations in Norway and Greenland, the Vikings lost the strength to wage battle against native populations, and their exploration of North America halted. On the other hand, with so many dead, labor became harder to find, bringing about better pay for workers and the end of Europe's system of serfdom. Studies suggest that surviving workers had better access to meat and higher quality bread. the lack of cheap labor may have also contributed to technological innovation. After the Black Death, there were additional outbreaks of bubonic plague. In 1665 in London, killing 15% of the city's population. In 1720 in Marseille in France, killing 30% of that city's population. In 1770 in Moscow, killed 100,000. The worst was an outbreak in Asia in the mid-19th century. In a dozen years, it killed 12 million people, 10 million of whom were from India. In the 20th century, there was another outbreak of the plague that deserves mention because it was the first in the United States, and it occurred in San Francisco's Chinatown. It lasted from 1900 to 1904 and killed 119 people. Dr. Joseph Kinyoun, the founder of the United States Hygienic Laboratory, the predecessor of the National Institutes of Health, documented the outbreak. He instituted a quarantine of residents of Chinatown. But this did not sit well with then California Governor Henry Gage and the state's business interests, such as the Southern Pacific Railroad. They publicly disputed the diagnosis for 2 years and decried the decline of economic activity associated with the quarantine. Does any of this sound familiar? Gage and his business allies launched a smear campaign against Kinyoun, aided and abetted by one of the city's leading newspapers, the San Francisco Chronicle. The federal government eventually reached a deal with Gage. The state agreed to stop attacking Dr. Kinyoun and start fighting the plague, and in exchange, the feds would remove Kinyoun from San Francisco. Here is a political cartoon published at the time. Smallpox is one of the oldest and deadliest diseases. It is thought to date back to ancient Egypt when a smallpox-type rash was discovered on 3 mummies dating to the 3rd century BCE. Smallpox outbreaks afflicted mankind for centuries. It was a persistent menace that killed 3 out of 10 people it infected and left the rest with pockmarked scars. Smallpox did not discriminate among its victims. Numerous European monarchs died from the disease, which impacted the dynastic succession of many kingdoms. Among those who died of smallpox was the French King Louis XV and Peter II of Russia, the grandson of Peter the Great. Many people from around the world contracted the disease but survived. They included 11-year-old Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the Lakota chief Sitting Bull, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Survivors also included these men. George Washington became infected with smallpox on a visit to Barbados in 1751. Andrew Jackson developed the illness after being taken prisoner by the British during the American Revolution. And Abraham Lincoln contracted the disease during his presidency, possibly from his son Tad, and was quarantined shortly after giving the Gettysburg Address. In 18th century Europe, it is estimated 400,000 people per year died from the disease. Eventually, smallpox became the first virus epidemic to be entered by a vaccine, thanks to the efforts of a British doctor named Edward Jenner. Here is a famous photograph of the difference between those vaccinated and those who were not. After a concerted worldwide effort, the World Health Organization in December 1979 declared the disease eradicated. But the most consequential devastation caused by a smallpox pandemic was wrought on the native populations of the New World when the smallpox virus arrived in the early 16th century with the first European explorers and conquerors. The indigenous peoples of modern-day Mexico and the United States had zero natural immunity to smallpox, and the virus cut them down by the tens of millions. Historians note that there hasn't been a kill-off in human history to match what happened in the Americas. 90 to 95% of the indigenous population was wiped out over a century. Mexico went from 11 million people pre-conquest to 1 million. The disease helped a Spanish force led by Hernan Cortés to conquer the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1519, and another Spanish force led by Francisco Pizarro to conquer the Incas in 1532. Even with their superior weapons, it is unlikely that Spain could have projected power across such a great distance and defeated the large and powerful Amerindian empires. But the Aztec and Incan armies had been ravaged by disease and were unable to withstand the Spanish forces. The historical impact of the Spanish and Portuguese conquest of Central and South America cannot be underestimated. By the end of the 18th century, here's what those empires looked like. There is another fascinating impact of the disease pandemic, which killed 56 million Native Americans in the 16th and 17th centuries. Research published last year suggests that it may have altered Earth's climate as vegetation growth on previously tilled land drew so much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, it caused a cooling event. With few people left to farm, scientists estimated that millions of acres of land previously used for agriculture fell into disuse. As forest, savanna, and other vegetation reclaimed the land, this additional vegetation would have pulled enough carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to lower the planet's temperature. The ice core record from Antarctica supports this theory, as air bubbles trapped in the ice show a fall in carbon dioxide around 1610, which corresponds to the beginning of the Little Ice Age. An estimated 500 million people around the world caught this virulent influenza caused by an H1N1 virus with genes of avian origin. It is estimated that well over 50 million people died, making it the worst pandemic ever documented. Although it was called the Spanish flu, this influenza virus actually originated on the Kansas prairie, where dirt-poor families farmed under primitive conditions. We do not know the specific farm, but the community was most likely Santa Fe, now a ghost town in Haskell County. In any event, it spread to young farmers who were drafted for World War I and reported for duty at Camp Funston in Fort Riley, the largest training facility in the Army. It was full of makeshift, non-insulated barracks housing 250 soldiers each. The camp teemed with soldiers from all over the Midwest training for duty in France. As the men coughed and sneezed, it spread germs within the Army barracks, onto trains across the United States, and then onto ships headed to Europe. Within 6 months, the flu was a full-blown pandemic. More died from the Spanish flu than all the military and civilian deaths during World War I, which had just ended. 675,000 died in the United States alone. Relative to the size of the US population at the time, it would be the equivalent of 2.1 million deaths today. Mortality was high in people younger than 5 years old, 20 to 40 years old, and 65 years and older. The high mortality in healthy people, especially in the 20 to 40-year-old age group, was a unique feature of this pandemic. A polio epidemic that started in New York City caused 27,000 cases and 6,000 deaths in the United States. The disease mainly affects children and sometimes leaves survivors with permanent disabilities. One of the most famous victims was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Continued outbreaks of polio continued until the Salk vaccine was developed in 1954. With its roots in China, the Asian flu claimed more than 1 million lives. The virus that caused the pandemic was a blend of avian flu viruses. The 2009 swine flu pandemic was caused by a new strain of H1N1 virus that originated in Mexico before spreading to the rest of the world. In 1 year, the virus infected as many as 1.4 billion people across the globe and killed between 150 and 575,000 people. It primarily affected children and young adults, and 80% of the deaths were in people younger than 65. Ebola ravaged West Africa with 28,600 reported cases and 11,300 deaths. The first case to be reported was in Guinea, and the disease quickly spread to Liberia and Sierra Leone. The bulk of the cases and deaths occurred in these 3 countries. There is no cure for Ebola, although efforts at finding a vaccine are ongoing. I left HIV/AIDS to last because the scale of the pandemic and how many people have died from it is not widely appreciated. The human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, is the virus that leads to the disease acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS. It is widely believed that the HIV virus originated in the Congo around 1920 when it crossed from chimpanzees to humans. Sporadic cases of AIDS were documented prior to 1970. By 1980, the HIV virus may have already spread to 5 continents. AIDS has claimed the lives of over 37 million people since HIV was first identified as the virus that causes the disease. Accordingly, it is one of the worst pandemics in human history. At first, the disease appeared to be confined largely to gay men because it is mostly transmitted through the exchange of bodily fluids during sexual activity. But it can also be spread by sharing needles and syringes, and less commonly from mother to child during pregnancy, birth, or breastfeeding. Today, 64% of the estimated 40 million people with HIV live in sub-Saharan Africa, and women make up a majority of its victims. As Yale professor Frank Snowden suggests, pandemics demonstrate the moral relationships we have towards each other. There is no better evidence of this than the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Many believe the government initially dragged its feet in funding research into the development of a cure for the disease due to homophobia. Some in the United States even believe the disease was a form of divine punishment for immoral behavior. In a survey of doctors in the mid to late 1980s, a substantial number of physicians said they did not have an ethical obligation to treat and care for patients with HIV/AIDS. Many other healthcare workers resisted treating victims for fear of contracting the disease themselves. In response, a very strong HIV/AIDS activist community formed, which pushed government for more support and to raise awareness of the disease among the general population. That has largely turned the tide on the perception of the disease. Although there is no known cure, medication developed in the 1990s now allow people with the disease to experience a normal lifespan with regular treatment. Epidemiologists use math and scientific principles to understand disease, project its consequences, and figure out ways to survive and overcome it. They forecast how diseases will spread under different conditions, and their models allow policymakers to foresee challenges, understand trend lines, and make the best decisions for the public good. But there is one factor that these models can't predict, and that is the extent to which their work becomes politicized. With over 217,000 COVID-19 cases and rising, the United States is scrambling to fight the pandemic, but neither the government nor the public health system was prepared. Initially, the president downplayed the severity of the outbreak. Then it was discovered that the strategic stockpile is desperately short of ventilators for critically ill patients and masks, gowns, and face shields to protect healthcare workers. Now we see the process for distributing essential supplies and equipment that are available is in chaos. California, the state with the largest population in the country, is trying to procure 5,000 ventilators for its hospitals. The federal government sent them 170 broken ones. New York is at the epicenter of the nation's outbreak. The state requested 2.2 million N95 masks and got only 78,000. New Jersey, next door to New York, has received only 5% of the essential supplies it sought from FEMA. But somehow the state of Florida received 100% of what it requested, including 180,000 masks, more than double that of New York. In the meantime, political leaders continue to snipe at one another while President Trump bristles at criticism. Most Americans are now stuck at home, children are out of school, and the economy is in free fall. Professor Snowden also reminds us that pandemics hold up a mirror to human beings to show us who we really are. In early April, there were over 13,000 passengers and crew members stuck on a dozen cruise ships on the world's oceans. Although only a small number of people on these ships have contracted COVID-19, the cruise lines have been forbidden to medevac the most critically ill patients to shoreside hospitals. And one government after another has refused to allow the ships to dock in their countries. Two Holland America cruise ships, Rotterdam and Zaandam, were even refused permission to dock in Fort Lauderdale, a port from which they normally operate. During good times, the cruise industry provides billions of dollars of revenue and thousands of jobs to Floridians. But during this pandemic, an urgent test of our common humanity, the state for several days slammed the door on the people on board these ships, desperate to go home. Finally, we have just learned that Dr. Anthony Fauci, one of America's top medical experts and a member of the nation's coronavirus task force, has received death threats. He now requires personal security from law enforcement at all times. The COVID-19 pandemic has indeed held up a mirror to American society. What do we see?